Hey students, this is Professor Gore, and in this part we're going to be talking about the U.S. victory in Europe and so forth. And another part we'll talk about the war in the Pacific. So this part will also include North Africa as well, even though it's not part of the European theater. It ends up happening right before the United States invades Italy. So we had talked about in the a previous lecture on the World War II, Part 1, talked about the Atlantic Charter. So even before Pearl Harbor, FDR had met with Winston Churchill secretly on a U.S. ship in the Atlantic area. And so this began a partnership and a friendship between FDR and Churchill that's going to continue throughout the war. And they actually had a really good relationship that helped, excuse me, help both countries end up fighting well alongside each other and so forth. Excuse me. So I've covered this before. I'm going to go over this briefly. We've talked about what Japan does with Pearl Harbor, and so let's look at some figureheads here. Now, China would be the fourth big ally, but historians usually refer to the three most powerful countries' leaders that were part of the Allies, and that's Churchill of Great Britain, FDR of the United States, and Joseph Stalin of the Soviet Union. The Axis powers consisted of Mussolini and, of course, Hideki Tojo, who's really running things in Japan more so than the Emperor Hirohito. So this picture right here is taken at the end of towards the last 6 months of the war. In fact, just about a couple months before FDR actually died. And this was taken at the Yalta Conference, which I'm going to cover in a later lecture. But the relationship between Britain, the U.S., and the Soviet Union was a little bit rocky. The U.S. and Britain didn't trust Stalin for several reasons. One, he is a mass murderer, or at least orders mass murders. So, for instance, when they invaded Poland along with the Nazis in 1939, on the eastern part of Poland that the Soviet Union occupied, they rounded up all the Polish officers and sent them to basically a gulag where Stalin had them liquidated, which basically means he had NKVD officers and men shoot them, and they were buried in a mass grave. And so really Stalin should have been, and his regime should have been brought to crimes against humanity. But because of the rocky situation with the Cold War after World War II, he was not. Also, the Soviet Union had an agreement with the Nazis to kind of create this 10-year non-aggression pact and so forth. Stalin did not trust the United States and Britain because he wanted them to invade Europe and open up a second front in 1942. Churchill convinces FDR that that's not feasible in 1942, and they actually delay the invasion until June of 1944. But Stalin is calling for it in 1943 as well. The reason why Churchill encourages FDR to not invade France in 1942 or 43 is because they hadn't really got a hold on the Battle of the Atlantic. German submarines were sinking a lot of Allied ships. Churchill knew that they needed to get a ton of American soldiers over there, plus a lot of supplies, really well-planned invasion for it to be successful. And it was a brilliant planned invasion with Operation Overlord at D-Day on the coast of Normandy. Had it not been so planned out and meticulously designed, it probably would have been a disaster against the Nazi Third Reich. So that was a reason. Secondly, didn't have the supplies, material, and plus Churchill wanted to bomb the German industrial military machine, both in their factories in Germany and some of the other factories they had started taking over in France. So that way it would weaken the Germans' ability for supplies and so forth. It paid off, but it led to a much rockier relationship with Stalin. Stalin, on the Eastern Front, was suffering by far the heaviest casualties of the war. The Germans suffered the heaviest casualties on the Eastern Front. The Soviets lost more men than anybody else. Of course, they put a lot more men into combat, whether they had proper firearms or not. Oftentimes they would charge and one guy would have a rifle and one guy would have the extra ammo. And when the guy with the rifle gets shot, the guy with the extra ammo is supposed to pick it up and continue. If they retreated, they would have their own men shoot them down with machine guns to motivate them. So you're going to have more casualties when you do stuff like that and so forth. And so I love this picture right here. Here is Churchill and FDR kind of chumming it up, and Stalin's kind of the awkward third wheel there. and so forth. So there are several war conferences throughout World War II. The first one technically was the Atlantic Charter, but after the United States enters the war, Churchill and FDR met in Washington. And that's where he convinces FDR to, instead of invading France first, he's going to convince FDR that the best course of action is to invade North Africa and the Mediterranean area, which he called the soft underbelly of Europe, and we'll cover that. They agreed to send a lot of aid to China to help fight the Japanese. And they're eventually going, by their invasion of North Africa, they're hoping that Germany is going to send a lot more men and material to North Africa and help ease up on the Eastern Front for the Soviets. Then, after the United States invades North Africa, which I'll show you the map in just a minute, Churchill and FDR met in Casablanca, which is the name of a famous movie, but also a city in Morocco, beautiful city. And at that point, after they were victorious in North Africa, they decide that they're going to invade Sicily and then Italy next. They also decided that they were going to invade France in 1944. And also, they were only going to accept an unconditional surrender of Germany. They wanted to completely rebuild Germany and make it where it's not going to fight another world war, which has been successful so far. Also, that they agreed to up the war in the Pacific, so focus on trying to defeat Japan more so than they had been in the Pacific. Then, after the United States and Britain have captured Sicily and are attacking the Italian peninsula, Stalin demanded a meeting, and they met in the capital of Iran today. It's called the Tehran Conference. First meeting between FDR, Churchill, and Stalin. It's the first of two. And Stalin is demanding to know when that second front is going to be open. They basically promise they're going to invade in the summer of 1944. And General Eisenhower is appointed as the head of the Allied forces. They're going to invade France and so forth at that time. And so this is the war conference, or the first meeting of the three, and so forth for this. Now, one thing to take note of, that Stalin actually had infiltrated every level of the U.S. government with spies during World War II, because he really did not trust the U.S. government and our ability to open up the second front, and he was wondering if we were going to betray him. That's how he actually found out about the atomic bomb before the Vice President Harry S. Truman actually knew about it. Now, Dwight D. Eisenhower is going to be the Supreme Allied Commander in Europe. So E for Europe. His last name starts with an E. The five-star general is actually George C. Marshall, who's going to be back in Washington with FDR. But Eisenhower is going to be a four-star general, brilliant commander, and really one of the great generals in American history. Great at planning things, ends up becoming an American president in the 1950s. And one of the most beloved Americans of the 20th century. One of a guy that was controversial at the time, but extremely talented, a guy named George S. Patton. He was a three-star general and our most talented tank commander, had been successful against the Germans in Sicily, but ends up getting demoted because of slapping a soldier who was in there for shell shock in the hospital. Eventually gets appointed over the Third Army after he had the Seventh Army taken from him, and drives through parts of France and covers more territory than any other American commander during World War II. Another guy who is not as given the recognition that he deserves in American history, just because of movies tend to focus on Patton and Eisenhower and so forth. But Omar Bradley was really a brilliant commander. Originally was under Patton in North Africa and Sicily, and then eventually gets promoted above Patton. And they were actually friends and definitely had a deep respect for each other. And Bradley was one that was able to kind of get Patton in line when his mouth would spout off and so forth, kind of as a calming force. And he was one of our top commanders at the D-Day invasion, and really was loved by his men. More so than other commanders. In the Pacific, you have Chester Nimitz. So the admiral that was in command at Pearl Harbor, he gets blamed for not being prepared for the Pearl Harbor invasion. He gets replaced by Chester Nimitz, and really one of the most talented naval commanders in American history. Chester Nimitz is going to be over the war in the Central Pacific. So a lot of the islands they're going to be taking, like Wake and um, other island networks that I'll show you when we get to the Pacific War theater. And then this guy, Bernard Montgomery of the British, is going to be a famous British tank commander who won at the Battle of El Alamein, which turns the North Africa campaign around. Also was kind of at odds with General Patton throughout the war. Both of them were prima donnas. The most famous German commander that the American forces faced was a guy named Erwin Rommel. And they're going to face him. Montgomery fought against him in North Africa. Patton and so forth fought against him in North Africa. He later gets transferred to Europe, and then the American and British forces are going to fight him in France. Doug MacArthur was the American commander. Was actually from Arkansas. That is given command of the Southwest Pacific, so like the Philippines, New Zealand, the Solomon Islands, and so forth. He's going to be the Army commander over that. He was commander in the Philippines and is forced to ordered to evacuate by FDR. And he promised, I will return to the Philippines, and he's going to return so later in 1944 after the Battle of Leyte Gulf. So let's look at this map right here. At the height of Nazi Germany in 1942, boom, that is the territory that they had acquired. A lot of territory they had taken in 1941, but their furthest extent into the Soviet Union was by 1942, and not until they get bottlenecked at the Battle of Stalingrad does their advance slow, and eventually they get driven back by the Soviet Union starting in 1943. So what ends up happening, you look right here from this map, the United States lands two invasions, both with the British and the Americans. One is at Morocco, another one at Algiers. Actually, the first American forces fight against not Germans, but actually French Vichy forces, because what happens when Germany surrenders, northern Germany right here is occupied Germany, and southern Germany was supposed to be this Vichy France that was loyal to the Germans. In fact, this government actually hands over a lot of their Jews to the Germans to be sent to the death camps. And so it takes about 24 hours to convince the Vichy French forces that we're not their enemy. We eventually used those forces led by Charles de Gaulle, kind of a prima donna French commander that demanded to be Supreme Allied Commander, and Eisenhower politely tells him no. He commands French forces throughout the rest of the war. And in fact, if you ever fly into Paris, Charles de Gaulle Airport is named after him. He later becomes a French president. American forces face off against the Germans here and don't do very well initially. In fact, Rommel's forces kind of mop the floor with Americans. We don't do very well. The original forces, Patton, once he comes in from Morocco, comes in and takes over and kind of whips them into shape, and they defeat Rommel's forces that drive them back into Tunis. Now, over here, Rommel was trying to capture the Suez Canal and cut off a lot of the oil to the British. Was been a very strategic victory for the Germans, but he has turned back. It was a turning point in North Africa at El Alamein by Bernard Montgomery. He retreats to get over here to get closer to reinforcements. Now, certainly the Germans and the Italian forces could have held on against the Americans and the British for quite some time in Tunisia, but they are not reinforced and they are not resupplied. Basically, the Italian Navy tries to evacuate as many as they can, but they really left an entire German division there that they should have evacuated. But the reason why they get preoccupied is because reinforcements and troops get sent here at Stalingrad, the worst battle of world history, which I'll cover later. That is the focus of Hitler and the German forces. They should have reinforced here, retreated from Stalingrad and regrouped, but they don't. It's one of the grave mistakes for the Germans during World War II. This is the soft underbelly that British and Americans attacked first. Stalin wants that second front there, though, and he's going to be angered about it, and one of the contributing factors of the Cold War. Now, the next spot the United States is going to invade is going to be Sicily. Now, here's a picture of Montgomery and Rommel after the Battle of El Alamein. And so Stalingrad is what's going to be the turning point of the war in Europe without question. Hitler arguably loses the war on the Eastern Front at Stalingrad. It's not like the only battle that they lost. They lost at Kursk in December of 1943 as well as a big victory for the Soviets. But Stalingrad is a tremendous loss because so many German troops get killed or captured there. The United States is actually, along with Britain, are going to invade Sicily next. Now, I want to give you some stats on Stalingrad real quick. While I have this up here. So it is the worst battle in world history. Let me kind of go back here to explain what's happening here. So when the Germans invade Operation Barbarossa in 1941, they have driven the Soviets back. The summer offensive is very effective. But the Russian winter of 1941 and early 1942 sets in, and the Germans are stalled. They regroup in 1942 and launch another spring and summer offensive, and this one they're driving back. Hitler decided here, because he sent a three-prong attack into the Soviet Union, the southern part, he wanted to capture these oil fields. Now, Stalingrad, the only reason why Hitler wanted to capture it is because it really has no strategic importance, is it carries the name of Stalin. So Hitler had sent a light infantry brigade to capture it, and while he sent his armored divisions down here to capture the oil fields. Stalin, meanwhile, had ordered his troops to defend the city at all costs because it held his name. What saved the Russians as well is he had taken the industry of the Soviet Union and moved it east of the Ural Mountains, a little further away from German bombardment and tough to find. So what happens is the light infantry unit gets surrounded here by the Soviets because it's put a lot of forces there. The armored divisions come up from the south and then try to penetrate to save the light infantry division. And what ends up happening is at Stalingrad, eventually the Soviets work their way around the armored divisions and surround them and then starve them out. It was some of the nastiest fighting ever of world history in the streets. When it's all said and done, about 80 so thousand Germans end up surrendering. The rest have been killed or captured. Out of that number that survived Stalingrad, they get sent to Siberia to the POW camps. The Soviet Union releases them in the early 1950s. There's less than 5,000 that have survived, if that tells you anything. So it's about 1 million men on both sides fighting against each other, tons of artillery guns, lots of tanks. You can see how many more tanks that the Soviets put in because Stalin wanted that city defended at all costs. And it is terrible. So once Stalingrad, the Germans lose there, they launch another summer offensive in 1943 to try to turn the tide. And the Soviets, for the first time, actually stop the Germans at Kursk. First time they stopped a summer offensive. And then they start driving. And from that point on, they're going to drive across Eastern Europe and liberate areas held by the Germans. And actually, the Russians are the ones who uncover most of the concentration camps because a lot of them are in Eastern Europe. Because Eastern Europe is where the largest Jewish population was located. So, and I'll cover the Holocaust in a later lecture, that terrible topic. Okay, so Stalingrad happened. Then you have the invasion of Sicily. And so the Italian campaign is called Operation Torch. The United States and British forces don't capture all of Italy until 1945. It was actually kind of one of the forgotten theaters of World War II and a really terrible place to fight because of the mountainous terrain. It's great to defend if you're the Germans. It's terrible to terrible to attack if you're the Americans. The United States and British had captured about 275,000 German troops there. Easily could have evacuated those men, but they don't. Definitely need those guys to fight later in the war. So the Americans and the British land at Sicily here. The British, for public relations reasons, we were supposed to let them capture Messina, which is going to capture Sicily. Patton is a prima donna and wants to capture it regardless. So he swings over here, captures Palermo against orders, and then comes over here and beats the British to Messina. And so that was controversial, but really what he gets demoted for was that he had slapped a soldier he found in a hospital who was, he called a coward. And the Seventh Army is removed from him and given to somebody else. So after that, the American and British forces are going to land and try to capture the southern part of Italy. Now, one of the forgotten battles of World War II is Monte Cassino. There's a James Bond movie also called Monte Cassino because there's a famous monastery that's on the top of the hill called Monte Cassino. And it was the Germans. We had defeated a lot of the Italian forces, and eventually Italy is going to surrender when Rome is captured in June of 1944. But the Americans are going to continue to fight British forces in Italy through the remainder of the war in Europe. And so Monte Cassino, we can't break through. Um, Tremendous heavy casualties. In fact, a Texas unit had the worst casualty rate of any American unit during World War II. A lot of African Americans saw tremendous combat in the Italian theater. The United States decides to make a daring amphibious landing behind the German lines at Anzio. They are victorious there, and they're able to liberate Rome a couple days before the Normandy invasion took place on June 6, 1944. My birthday happens to be on June 6th. So, fitting I was born 40 years after D-Day, and I'm a history teacher. So that happens. But really, where the war is won for the Americans and the British and the French are right here. Now, one thing I would like to mention to give credit is Poland had a free Polish division that was armed by the Americans, and they actually fight very bravely in the Italian theater to help win World War II. So way to go, Poland. So here's American tanks rolling by the Colosseum to liberate Rome. Mussolini is later executed by his own men in 1945. But Italy surrenders, but Germany is going to fight on in Italy until the end of the war. So next, the United States is going to land at Normandy. Now, the Americans knew because of spying that the Germans were terrified of Patton. They thought he was the commander that was going to lead this invasion. So they used him as a decoy to move throughout the Mediterranean, and the Germans would move troops over to Greece or Turkey based on where Patton moved. They leaked out fake plans that Patton was was going to lead this invasion. They were going to attack at Calais, the closest area to France. And so Hitler put one of his best divisions there, the 15th Armored Division, right here at Calais. They even set up blow-up tanks like that, that were fake. So when the Germans would fly over, they would just see these look like real tanks there. And they set up all this fake stuff, and it was great espionage. I'm surprised there hadn't been a movie made about it. But really, our real supplies and so forth were under thick forests over here, and they were going to be made in Normandy. So what ends up happening, the invasion was supposed to happen on June 5th, 1944. It ends up, because of bad weather, that happened on June 6th. Now, the night before, Americans and British paratroopers landed behind enemy lines to disrupt communication and supplies. And then 2 American invasion forces, 2 British and 1 Canadian, so way to go, Canada, get these beachheads, and they invaded Normandy. Now, the 2 most heavily defended beaches were actually Omaha and Utah, which you see portrayed. One of those beaches, Utah Beach, you see portrayed at the opening scene of Saving Private Ryan. It's actually portrayed very accurately. They actually had World War II veterans who were there screened the film in the 1990s before they had passed away and get their thoughts on it. They said the only thing missing was the smell of combat from that scene. And so it is the largest military invasion in world history. A 5,000 group of ships with 150,000 men landed across the Normandy beach. I actually had a classmate of mine because when I was in college, I interviewed some World War II veterans, and I did so again in grad school. It was part of this project in Clark County where I went to college at. And one of our classmates interviewed a guy who was on the 6th wave at Normandy, and so he said when he got out of the boat, the water was nothing but red from blood. If that tells you anything. In fact, he couldn't even finish the interview. So it is an incredible planned invasion and performed brilliantly. Even though despite heavy losses, Americans did very well. Of course, anybody that's going to land on those beaches are going to have heavy, heavy casualties. They were able to blow their way to get to the machine gun turrets and then use flamethrowers to kill them. And it was successful. What ends up happening, though, is they're able to establish a beachhead, which I'm going to show you in just a minute. Sorry, the images were a little messed up here. So you can see where the paratroopers land behind Utah Beach and where British paratroopers land behind Operation Sword Beach. And this is Eisenhower giving the order for the D-Day invasion, Operation Overlord. And you can see right here what troops look like when they were getting off of those Higgins boats. Those are the amphibious landing craft. Brilliant invention during the war. And you can see here's troops getting out. Sorry, my technology's messed messed up here. That's actually all the supplies being unloaded to beat the snot out of the Nazis. America. All right, here's what Normandy Beach looks like today. So what's interesting is that the United States and the British and the Canadians have trouble breaking through. After they established a beachhead, there is a part of France there called the Hedgerow Country. In fact, several World War II veterans I interviewed fought there. And what the Hedgerow Country is, it's these fences for these farms, and it's typically a stone fence, and then you have ivy that grows over it, and so it's actually taller than I am. I'm 6'4". And so it's really great to defend that. So American or British forces would be coming around a corner of a fence and just get mowed down by Germans. In fact, that happened to one of the veterans I interviewed. I interviewed him at the age of 97, one of the most cheerful men I've ever met in my life. He was riding a tank early one morning, and I guess it was a cool morning because you could see his breath. It was right at daybreak. And they came around a corner. There was a German force there, ambushed them, mowed down everybody in the tank. He was left for dead. And what saved his life was an American unit came by later, and a medic saw being a cool morning, saw a slight breath coming out of his mouth, gave medical attention, and saved his life. He ended up going to a hospital and was disabled permanently for the rest of his life and lived off with a disability check from the United States government. And so it's very difficult to break through that. So what they did is American forces landed Patton's Third Army down here south, down in this region. They were able to break through German forces and then drive on, and that's what caused the Germans to pull out of the Hedgerow Country, and they were able to capture Paris in the summer of 1944. And then the goal is to make it to Germany by Christmas. So what ends up happening is they tried Operation Market Garden. It was a plan developed by the British, and it paratrooped men with the 101st Airborne Division and the British tank units and so forth. In fact, it's portrayed in the Band of Brothers miniseries. They thought that the Netherlands was going to be poorly defended and they could go right into Germany and capture Berlin by Christmas. Well, the Germans defended Netherlands much better, and Operation Market Garden was a failure. So we have to go into Germany the old-fashioned way right here. Now, what they didn't realize is Hitler had been moving his manufacturing centers underground, thanks to captured Soviet POWs and Jewish prisoners, among others, gypsies and so forth. And because since 1942, the British forces would bomb German targets every night. Of course, when you bomb at night, you're going to miss a bunch. A lot of civilians are killed. The Americans bombed in the daytime. Now, our bombing was much more effective, but we also had so many more air crew that were shot down over Germany and France. And in fact, until they started sending the bomber escort groups to protect them, it lowered the casualty number. And one of the most famous bomber escort group that had some of the fewest casualties was the Tuskegee Airmen, the all-black pilots during World War II who really did great things in 1944 and 1945. So Hitler, when he moved his industrial capacity underground, the United States and British assumed that the Germans were just about done. And actually, Patton predicted that he thought that the Germans might counterattack in the winter. So in the winter of 1944, the Germans launched a surprise counterattack. And the goal was they were going to try to capture Antwerp, Belgium. And if they could capture that port city, they could get access to the Allies' oil. That's where the United States dropped off their oil supplies, particularly gas, for tanks. Hitler was running out of gasoline for their planes and their tanks and so forth, and was getting desperate. Had he captured that, he thought he could turn the tide and maybe kind of sue for a different peace or whatever for the war. When they launch, it completely catches the Allies off guard. They drive the American forces back, but the 101st Airborne Division, with no winter clothing and only the supplies and ammo they had on them, they were sent in to defend the town of Bastogne. And it's really one of the greatest scenes in American military history, because at Bastogne, the 101st Airborne Division gets completely surrounded, and they hold off the Germans. The German commander told them that they should surrender, and his reply was nuts. So, like, it's nuts to surrender. Down to the south, Patton gets ordered, or Patton decides that his men can pull out of a pitched battle and move north to save the 101st Airborne Division. And in the process of that, they covered more mileage and engaged more enemy divisions in any American force in U.S. history. And it's incredible what Patton does. They liberate the 101st Airborne Division coming up from the south, but really what caused the German invasion to fail is they ran out of gas. Like literally, their tanks over here like literally stopped dead in fields running out of gasoline, and that's actually what caused the Germans to retreat. And then the Americans drive into Germany in early 1945. Really, what captures leads to the capture of Berlin is actually the Soviets. It's on the Eastern German side, so it makes sense that they would capture. The Russians had been seizing more and more in Eastern Europe as 1944 into 45. And it's interesting is whenever they seize an area, they implemented communist parties in those areas. And after the war, those communist parties are going to murder democratic leaders and run the rest out of town and do not allow free elections. Germany actually surrenders in early May of 1945. Once they capture the Germans destroyed a bunch of files and so forth, and they were able to find secret film and photographs and stuff of the atrocities that the Germans committed, particularly on the Eastern Front against the Eastern European Jews that I'll cover in the Holocaust lecture. But they also began using technologies such as the V-2 rocket. They were developing early drone bombing, and then they developed the first jets, which they used at the end of the war. They also tried to develop an atomic bomb, which actually were FDR, the reason why he decided to develop that with the Manhattan Project, because Germany was basically forcing all their top scientists to start working on military technology. And Eisenhower, which was a German Jew, had fled to the United States in the early 1930s. He had noticed, had heard from some of his friends what they were working on is developing a bomb to split the atom. And he writes a letter to FDR telling about this, and FDR wrote him a letter back, do you think this is something we should work on? And Einstein said later that it was the biggest regret of his life. He told him yes. And so had Germany put more effort and money towards that, they would have won the war with the atomic bomb. But thankfully, they don't. And the United States develops it, and we use it against the Japanese, which I'll cover in the Pacific War lecture. There were several assassination attempts on Hitler. The one that came the closest to being successful is done by Major Klaus von Stauffenberg. If you've ever seen the movie Valkyrie with Tom Cruise, it's about this attempt. He survives. There was other attempts on his life in 1945. He does commit suicide in his bunker with his new bride. There was his mistress for a long time, Eva Berlin, and then here she is. But she took her life, and they actually also gave poison to the German Shepherd and then shot it, and so forth. So this is the German High Command surrendering to the Allies, and more that surrendered. And this is what led to VE Day. Now, VE Day was a celebration, sure, but VJ Day, Victory over Japan, it's V for victory in Europe, victory over Japan in August of 1945 probably set off the greatest celebration in American history that we'll cover in the Pacific War lecture. Look at this. Boom. So, adios, Nazis. And this is Eisenhower with the cigar celebrating the victory in Europe. So pretty big day. These are American and Russian forces that meet at the Elbe River on April 25th, 1945. And this is Truman getting interviewed about that. Now, FDR had died in April of 1945 of brain hemorrhage, and his vice president, Harry S. Truman, is now going to become president and going to be the president at the end of the war. Okay, now we'll get to the Pacific War Theater in the next lecture.